All right. So this morning's service is intentionally multi-generational, but this is the moment that we set aside especially for our children and young people. Children and young people, my friends, if you'd like to come down here with the wand, perfect, exactly right. Thank you so much. And come with me, we'll share a story if you want to sit right here. All right. Hello. All right. Hi, friends. Okay. So, my name is Martha. I use she and her pronouns, and I am your Director of Religious Education. So today, we're going to be telling some stories from the history of our church and what we think that those stories might be asking us today. So right now, I'm going to tell you the first story in the stories we'll tell today. This is the story of how our church was first founded 375 years ago. So once upon a time, in this exact place, but in a time that was very different from our time, there lived a group of indigenous people. They were the Massachusetts, Pennacook, Namkag, among others, and they took care of and lived on this land and stewarded it for a long time. In 1629, white settlers first came to this land. They offered to buy the land in a deal which was not a fair deal. The white settlers had on their side guns and disease and money and power that the native peoples had less of. Two indigenous leaders, whose names were Squaw Sachem and Webb Coet, sold this land, but they didn't have a lot of other options. Later, many indigenous people who lived here died in wars and from disease. The white settlers who first lived here wanted to go to church, but the closest church to them was in Charlestown across the river. So they'd take something called the penny ferry, where you paid 1 penny to get on a boat, and you would sail across the river to go to church. But it was very, very cold in the winter and a very long way. So the people who wanted to live here decided they needed to found their own church. At the time, they wanted to vote, and the only way that you could vote is to be a member of a church. And even if you were a member of a church, you still had to be white and a man. So they decided to found their own church here in Malden. But there was a law at the time from the British magistrate that said you cannot found a church on your own without permission. But the ancestors of our church didn't necessarily agree with this rule. They weren't so good at following the rules that they didn't agree with. So they decided to take a risk and found a church by themselves outside of the law. For a few Sundays, we've talked about how our laws are not always right, and sometimes we have to do things outside of the law for justice. So the people then wanted to call a new minister for their church. They called 9 different ministers, all of whom said no. They said, "Hello, would you like to be the minister of First Parish of Malden?" No. Would you like to be the minister of First Parish of Malden? No. Would you like to be the minister of First Parish of Malden? No. Nobody wanted to be the minister of a church that had been founded outside of the law. So the people decided they needed to find somebody who was also willing to take these kind of risks. And that's how they found the Reverend Marmaduke Matthews. They had really cool names during this time. Reverend Marmaduke Matthews was somebody who had been expelled from the Church of England for preaching what he wanted to and not what he was told he should preach. The First Parish in Malden founders said, "That's our guy." So they invited him here, and he became the first minister of First Parish in Malden. 1 year after he became the minister, he was taken to trial by the general court for what the court said was weak preaching. I don't know what that means. Reverend Marmaduke Matthews had to stand trial, and the church decided that they would stand with their minister. In fact, 36 women signed a petition in his defense. It was the first act known of that kind of women's independence in the British colonies. Reverend Marmaduke Matthews was found guilty of weak preaching. He was fined £10. It was unable to be collected at the time, given to the fact that he owned no possessions other than books. This is the story of how our church was founded and our very first minister. Since the founding of the church, we have been a people willing to take risks. But how much risk are we really willing to take? We'll be thinking about that a little bit more later on in our service. So you are invited to stay here and play. If you want, you can also go up to the nursery, whatever you feel is right. Thank you for sharing this story with me.
All right, friends, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, you might remember this one. The lyrics are on the back of your order of service. We've got this song called Keep On Moving Forward by Pat Humphreys. I'm going to invite you to do this with me in a little bit of a different way this week. So if you are interested in getting up on your feet, now would be a great time to do that. If that's not your thing, then that's not your thing, and that's also fine with me. So we're going to start by keeping a beat, just counting 4 together, and you can clap or tap this in whatever way feels good to you. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're gonna really sink into this and start singing this verse together, feeling the lyrics, and at some point I might change up the rhythm. You hold steady, you do your thing. I trust you. I believe in you. We're gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna show our children courage. Show our children courage. Show our children courage. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna work for change together. Work for change together. Work for change together. turning back, never turning back. We're gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. Thank you, everyone. You did not expect to sing in harmony this morning, maybe, when you came to church. Thanks for taking that moment to sing together.
Our reading today is titled, If We Do Not Venture Out, by Marnie Harmony. If, on a starlit night, with the moon brightly shimmering, we stay inside and do not venture out, the evening universe remains a part of life we shall not know. If, on a cloudy day, with grayness infusing all, and rain dancing rivers in the grass, we stay inside and do not venture out, the stormy, threatening energy of the universe remains a part of life we shall not know. If, on a frosty morning, dreading the chilling air before the sunrise, we stay inside and do not venture out, the awesome cold, quiet, and stillness of the dawn universe remains a part of life we shall not know. If, through these grace-given days of ours, surrounded as we are by green life and brown death, hot pink joy and cold gray pain and miracles, always miracles, if we stay inside ourselves and do not venture out, then the fullness of the universe shall be unknown to us, and our locked hearts shall never feel the rush of worship.
The very first time I walked into this sanctuary, I noticed these words painted on the beam above my head. They're words from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 32. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. When I first read them, I didn't understand why, of all the verses in the Bible, those were the ones chosen for so central a beam and painted there more than 100 years ago. I continued to wonder about them. We are coming to the 375th anniversary of the founding of this church. Getting ready to celebrate this anniversary means pausing for a moment to think about the history of this church and what it might be telling us about where we are right now. This is a major milestone, and a milestone like this gives us a chance to think about how we have been together influences who we are in this moment and where we might want to be going next. A few years ago, we did a service about the history of the church, a series of small plays. And the staff and I ended up doing a lot of research into some stories that are at the heart of who we are. Many of these are stories that I didn't know before. We read books about the history of Malden, accounts of the history of the church, books about Universalism. So I have 3 stories for you this morning, one of which you have already heard earlier in the service about the founding of the church. And the church was originally founded as a Puritan church. So how did it come to be Universalist? This is my second story for you. In the late 1700s, Universalism was gaining popularity, and this kind of movement was starting to influence members of the First Parish community of the time. Universalism in particular thrived in opposition. It had found theological footing in using a gospel of universal salvation and unconditional love to counter the fire and brimstone type preaching and messages of predestination and a threat of hellfire that were popular with early Puritan preachers. In the 1700s, this church was briefly two churches, First Parish in Malden and the South Precinct Church. The South Precinct Church had a minister named Reverend Eliakim Williams, and he had published one of the first Universalist covenants. This was a fairly risky thing to do at the time, since the dominant theological trend was Calvinism, which says that only some people are saved and go to heaven. Many years later, First Parish in Malden needed to call a new minister. And at the time, a more conservative or orthodox group was in power within the church, but just barely. They called the Reverend Adiron Judson, who was a more conservative-leaning minister. And this prompted outrage from the more Universalist wing of the parish, who left. 21 members left and went to the South Precinct Church. They signed a document in protest of the calling of this minister, perhaps with some echoes to these founding stories. And only 6 years later, this minister resigned, citing his inability to reconcile theological differences in the church. After this, the two churches, First Parish and the South Precinct Church, decided to merge and become one again. They brought Reverend Willis as their minister. Now, to me, this is an early example of a trend that I've seen in the history of our church, a trend of internal community organizing and power building, in which people are able to gain access to power, push the rules, and shift the church in a new direction, but using those same established channels. It's a trend of taking some risk. After Reverend Willis, the church still had theological tensions, and in 1827, it was time to call a new minister, and these tensions boiled over. So at the end of August, the more orthodox-leaning faction of the church had a majority, but they couldn't get consent from the whole church to call a minister. In March, only 6 months later, the Universalists in the church had formed a coalition majority, and they called the Reverend Sylvanus Cobb. They were able to swing an internal vote, just barely, to elect Reverend Cobb, and 65 members of the church this time left over that decision. Sylvanus Cobb was the first Universalist minister of First Parish in Malden, and this was how the church became Universalist. Now, this is a fairly fascinating story to me, not just because there are 2 annual meetings with a 6-month gap in which they made 2 very different decisions, but also because it's a story about power building and about strategy. It's a story of a people who used those strategies within their framework of democratic decision-making to steer the church in a new direction. Similar to the story of how the church was founded, this story shows me how deep the values of autonomy and self-determination run in our community. We are a people who want to control our own destiny. We are a people who believe in taking risks to challenge authority. I have a third, this is a final story to tell you about how these values appeared in our history. So over a century later, this is the 1960s, the governing bodies of Unitarianism and Universalism were deciding whether or not to merge to become one faith. First Parish in Malden was nervous about this project. So to research this story, I sat in the library and the office of our church, and I dug through congregational records and meeting minutes, board meeting minutes from the 1950s and 60s. At one point, I had the safe open, and I was leafing through handwritten congregational meeting records. I felt like Indiana Jones. Okay, maybe not, Indiana Jones wasn't not that cool, but at least a real church historian. He was not learning about Universalism in the parish. But here's what I learned. In 1959, First Parish first polled its members about merger, and overwhelmingly, they were not interested. The next year, they took a special vote to instruct their delegates who were attending General Assembly of the Universalist Church of America to add an amendment to the Constitution that said if the Unitarians and Universalists merge, nothing that the association could do would supersede the sovereignty of the parish. They declared the autonomy of the church to be the highest form of decision-making. I understand this story to fall in line with the history of this church, who time and time again have shown a value of self-determination. The community was uncomfortable with top-down power structures, and they wanted to control their own decisions locally. In fact, they even invited an opposition group who was, funnily enough, called Unitarians and Universalists Against Consolidation, the UUAC, to use our space for meetings. In the notes from when they decided to allow this group to come, they said they valued making sure that minority views were truly heard in a democratic process. The parish valued dissent. They valued speaking up and speaking out. They wanted to make sure that everyone was heard and that authority was challenged. This was a risky action to take. At their annual meeting in 1960, they formally voted against the merger. Through these votes, it's clear to me that First Parish in Malden centered values of autonomy and self-governance in taking a risk. Values that have shown up in key moments like these 3 moments in our history. If we look at ourselves in relation to this history, a pattern emerges. We have been a people who values opposition. We like to push against the status quo. But our power analysis is rooted in those structures of bureaucracy. Our understanding of power says we are a people who can self-determine within the existing system. Later, the church did join the Unitarian Universalist Association, and in the 1970s became a Unitarian Universalist church. Today, I'm interpreting this history to understand how we can build a better world and believe that it can be built. When I look at our history, I'm tracing the patterns of our Universalist roots that influence our theologies of collective salvation, inherent worthiness, and divine grace. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to me. Now I understand this a little bit better. This is one of the most universalist passages from the New Testament. Now, when I walk down the central aisle of our sanctuary, I lift my eyes to this beam because it reminds me what our Universalist ancestors knew when they painted it there, that no matter what, we share a collective future. What happens to one of us happens to all of us. As UUs with a particularly Universalist heritage, we believe that all people are created equal and endowed with inherent worth and dignity that can never be taken away. Because we know this to be true, we are called to build a world that is free of oppression and violence, where everyone has what they need to thrive. And looking at our history, I've been thinking about how these values of self-determination and faithful risk-taking can help me to live out this belief. The right to self-determine is at the heart of many movements for social justice. The right for a people to get to decide what is best for ourselves and our communities. I think about with the fight for abortion justice, the fight for gender-affirming healthcare for all members of our community, and the struggle for all people in all places for autonomy over their bodies and destinies and futures. I believe that our values and our practices of self-determination and our willingness to take risks can be strategies for how we show up in the world right now to live a theology of universal love and of unconditional salvation. These are not just values that we hold dear, these are strategic practices for living out this theology, which is a risky theology already to have. Because having this belief that each of us is inherently worthy asks something big of us. When we know that to be true, it calls us into a higher way of being. There is a lot of change needed right now to create the world in our world that we are seeking to build, where everyone has what they need to thrive. It will take big risks to get there. It might take risks that are outside the law. It might take risks that challenge the structures and the status quo and the powers that be. It might take risks that turn the system on its head. But guided by love and guided by our history, because we are a people who have been willing to take risks and challenge authority, I know that we are well positioned right now to adapt to a changing world and to a changing faith. We have resources from our very own history to help us do this. We know how to fight power, how to fight the system, and to take our futures into our hands because we have done it before. And I want us to think about what the limitations of our risk-taking are, and maybe where we need to expand those limitations. So friends, as we come upon this 375th anniversary, I am looking at the history of this church and how it informs the story that we tell of who we are together. From the founding of our church outside of the law to becoming a Universalist church through the community organizing of members internally, to voting against the merger because of our desire to remain self-governing, this is a story of a people who fiercely protected and defended their community, who knew who they were and who they wanted to be. It is a faithful act to tell this particular story, to ask ourselves, what risks are we willing to take? What risks do our belief in universal salvation require us to take? And how far are we willing to take those risks? Our history positions us well to do the hard and necessary work of taking bold risks for justice in the creation of a new world. Because, as our ancestors knew when they painted this on our sanctuary beam, what happens to one of us happens to all of us. We are ever in this shared destiny together. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. Now is the time in our service where we celebrate the bounty in our lives by sharing some of that bounty with others. Today's offering will be shared between two organizations that provide direct financial resources to trans community members in crisis. The Transgender Emergency Fund of Massachusetts supports low-income and homeless transgender people here in Massachusetts, assisting with housing, prescription copays, transportation, personal supplies, and more. Trans Lifeline is a grassroots hotline and microgrants organization offering direct emotional and financial support to trans people in crisis for the trans community by the trans community. If you are here in the sanctuary, our ushers will come by with the baskets. If you are online, we will put the link in the chat. If this is your first time in worship, or if you are new to our community, please let the basket pass you by. Your presence is a gift.
I'm going to invite you to remain in your seats as we sing together an offering hymn and then our thanksgiving together. The hymn is 1058, Be Ours a Religion.